welcome everyone to the session on crowdsourced cybersecurity.
Wow.
My name is Raik, Jakschis, and I'm researcher at the NATO CCD COE's technology branch and will be your host for the next 90 minutes. So why is crowdsourced cybersecurity actually important? We heard it this morning that, for example, bug bounty programs, and also David Langer talked about it yesterday, that those approaches are fundamental in the future. Even the Washington Post posted in the beginning of 2015 the following: crowdsourcing America's cybersecurity is an idea so crazy it might actually work. We will concentrate in this panel on the sensor data, which is being used to forecast events, determine the risk of infrastructure and utilities, and how could this actually help to identify threat actors. This needs to be combined with an effective anomaly detection, and also some kind of trust has to be created within the network. But before going into further detail, I would like to introduce the panel. From right to left, Mr. Rupinder Paul. He's a computer science PhD student at the Discovery Analytics Center of Virginia Tech. His research centers on applied data sciences with an emphasis on event forecasting, threat analytics, and narrative generation using open source data. In the center, Martin Stohmeier. He's a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Oxford. His main research interests are currently in the area of network security, including wireless sensor networks and critical infrastructure protection. And on the very left, Professor David Chadwick. He's a professor of information systems security at the University of Kent and has over 140 publications in international journals, conferences, and workshops. So, as a lot of people are right now on their phones, and you might also be tweeting or texting. Don't worry about it. But the next gentleman will actually use this data to forecast events and determine risks of utilities. So I will give the stage up to Mr. Paul. The stage is yours. I hope you can give us some introduction into your project EMBERS and how you actually use this.
Thank you, Raik. So good afternoon, everyone. Today, I'm going to talk about a core technology that we developed for forecasting significant societal events using open source data. To be specific, the three core technology specific domains that I'll be talking about will be cybersecurity, threats on airports, and how we forecast protests like events and others civil unrest causing cases. So to begin with, I want to talk about what is the key motivation of doing something like this. Why do we want to forecast events? So forecasting technologies provide a very crucial platform to test social theories such as what are the key driving factors that govern collective action. And thanks to social media, these provide a very valuable tool for social scientists. And then the second and the third advantages or the key motivations would be that cater to the government and the law enforcement, where these technologies provide them with an early warning system, right? And where protection of the citizens, safeguarding critical infrastructure is paramount. And last but not the least, it caters to the commercial applications where multinational organizations who move goods across the physical or digital pathways in the world and want to know in advance what events might take place in the regions of their interest. So in order to build a good forecasting system, you need to find great indicators, clues, which can tell you what should be the scenarios in which a forecast needs to happen, and what good a source there is than social media, the wisdom of the crowd. And in this slide, I'm showing you a very neat example of how the information is flowing through a collective conversation. This particular case is about a shooting incident that happened in Houston Airport back in 2014, in 2013, where a TSA agent got shot, and then the man who committed that crime at the airport was also was shot dead with the shooting with the security forces. And this shows how, at different snapshots, how the Twitter evolves the conversation and how our model picks up that conversation. You'll see initially it starts off with some seed keywords, which pertain to some security-related keywords, and as you go all the way towards the left, you'll see more specific descriptions of that event. And this is a very key example how the conversations is evolving and what the crowd really tells us about on Twitter-like mediums. And another interesting way to look at to gain insights for forecasting technology is to observe and infer the crowd behavior. And this is a very neat example. We did a study a few years back using satellite imagery data. And what we were looking for was how the parking lots, how crowded parking lots in hospitals in Latin American region are. And this gave us a very good proxy indicator to predict flu counts. So how more crowded they are, for example, these are the parking lot boundaries, and the more crowded they are, that's a surrogate for a flu epidemic that's bound to happen. A similar case would be using open table data sets where more the reservations are canceled, that's a proxy for some epidemic happening in the region. So these two examples give us a very good motivation of why crowdsourcing is so important, but is crowd always right? And that's a very important question that we need to ask our data source, especially like a noisy Twitter-like medium. For example, in this case, we show you two networks at different snapshots. And the first snapshot is on 29 September 2014. This is during the Ebola crisis, the rumor mill that started off during the Ebola epidemic. And you'll see the big pink one here. Initially, people thought that it was because of a zombie apocalypse that has descended. And then we took another snapshot of using that rumor model that we have to build another network, a retweeting network of these keywords. And now we found that the terrorists were the biggest component of that rumor network. So these show you that the crowd is not always right. And this begs for a clarification where you want to ask, how is a crowd opinion really formed versus collective intelligence? By that I mean is crowd behavior is usually formed. It can be problematic in cases such as this, where online trolls, very polarizing actors such as online trolls and bots can overwhelm the system. It can infect online communities in a very polarizing way. And this is where it differs from collective intelligence. Collective intelligence is about is a very deliberate process where you use handful of experts, right? And they only have a partial knowledge, so together they form a consensus. So this is what we set out to build with EMBERS. So EMBERS stands for Early Model-Based Event Recognition Using Surrogates. And this is a technology that was developed by Virginia Tech along with other academic partners. And its goal is to analyze big data to study the population dynamics, forecast events for a variety of verticals. And this was a 22 million IRPA grant. And I'm going to give you a brief background about what EMBERS is. So it was originally funded through the Open Source Indicators program through IRPA. And it aims to develop this 24/7 running system, which is fully automated, runs on the cloud, and tries to forecast events across different verticals. And our initial focus was for Latin America. And we began this project since in 2012, and it's been running since then. And it started out like a tournament between two other teams, and it was downgraded at the end of the final year, and Discovery Analytics Center was the winner of that program. And I want to highlight how grand the vision of IARPA was. IARPA stands for the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Activity. It's called the sort of the DARPA for spies. And this exclusively cater to intelligence community. And we were very thankful for the opportunity and the grand vision IARPA had many years, like 5 years ahead of the curve, and put our research on the map. So what are the open source indicators? So this word cloud basically shows you all the different data sources that we considered in our program, Twitter and news being the majority of them, and then we considered other non-conventional data sources such as Foursquare, OpenTable, onion routing networks from Tor. So that was also used where the governments might try to control, or there is an increased traffic because there is censorship on social media. Our initial classes that we considered for this were influenza-like diseases and rare diseases. That was for the disease aspect. And then elections and other domestic political crises were also part of the program. And the most important was the civil unrest. And lately, what we have been trying to do is model our technology for other domains such as cybersecurity, threats on critical infrastructure, and then cyberbullying and mass migrations, which are new problems in our digital world, and we want to use open source indicators to forecast events for them. So the first use case of this technology that we have lately built on is crowdsourcing cybersecurity. And this stream graph is showing how the flow, the volume of 3 key event categories in cyber attacks have been flowing through since 2014 up till 2016. And you'll notice that how data breach events have been increasingly reported, and mind you, this does not give a full picture. It's only what actually is reported in social media. So the true numbers can actually be much higher. And so we built a system around this to better detect a clear signal of how cybersecurity events are reported online, especially through a Twitter-like medium. And in this case, you'll see the first blue spikes here are actually related to the account hijackings that happened for the iCloud accounts of celebrities in US early in 2014. And then all the way towards the end, you'll see big red spikes about the data breach events that happened to a dating website in Canada called Ashley Madison. And I'll talk more about that particular case study. So our algorithm is very unique. It's built for Twitter-like mediums, and it follows conversations. And if you see all the way towards the end, the word clouds, right, they'll give a very clear thematic view of what the cyber attack was. And it's gradually able to detect all the conversations that happen and in an evolving nature over time. So typical of all academic institutions, we believe in report cards, and every system that we build has its own report card. So our approach, the first table that you see is about how good we were in filtering and recognizing tweets which relate to cybersecurity events. And then the second table is about how using that data, using that clear signal that some cybersecurity like event has happened, how good are we to characterize that event into a full-formed forecast. So you'll see that our precision in both categories is pretty good. We are well over 75% in most cases. In certain cases, recall is compromised for a better precision, better quality of those event detections. So the second case that I'm going to be talking about is how we address threat on airports, which is one of the critical infrastructures for any country, and how we use this reciprocity modeling between news and social media. So we have talked about how social media can be noisy. So what if we can use news medium to sort of reciprocate and have more, allow more sanity towards what we see in the Twitter-like medium. And you'll notice that in this particular example, so every time a bomb threat happens, flights get diverted. And our approach here was not to build a models for detection or build a probabilistic model. We wanted to have a risk ranking approach. So risk ranking has been proved very useful for threat analytics. It helps gauge for example, in case of airports, our key motivation was how do we rank mid-sized or small-sized airports among each other as compared to large-sized airports. So by that I mean that social media generally has a lot of volume for very high volume, high traffic, passenger traffic airports, but what about the mid-sized airports? How do you compare their threat evaluation? Where do they rank in the hierarchy of different sized airports? So our approach addresses a risk ranking methodology. And another key good example of that is the online threats that get issued through Twitter. And this graph shows you how well the system assesses the threat, especially in that window when the threat actually occurs. And you'll see in this particular example, some ISIS-inspired threat tweets were issued by some Twitter users, and then that caused a big scare in US. Over 20 flights over the span of 1 week got delayed or diverted. And what we did was we built a system around this approach. What you see here is a rank flow. So each column basically gives a ranking of the airport by the threats in a decreasing order and how the threat flows over time. So this allows an analyst to come into play and see how, for one airport, has the threat evolved over time. And what we provide here for the analyst is a way to see what the audit trail looks like. So audit trail provides the tweets and the news articles that were involved into generating that rank for that airport. And another cool thing that we do with the system is generate a natural language paragraph, whereby research has proved that if you show someone simply data tables, and they have to make a decision out of it, it's better that they get a paragraph, a summary of what they're looking at, what visuals they're looking at. So this full system provides this overall all-inclusive approach, so they can see what's happening, they can look through the tweets, look at the data, what generated that ranking, and what is an overall summary when they report to their superiors who are going to make the decisions. And the third case is forecasting civil unrest. So this has been a major stress focus area for us at Discovery Analytics Center, and we provide very specific, very granular warnings. So the warnings address who will be protesting, so that is a population, when they will be protesting, the date, when and where, down right to the city level location and why, the event type of that protest. And we initially started out with Latin America, right? And then we gradually covered North Africa and some Middle Eastern countries as well in the program. And one interesting case study that I want to share with you is the Venezuelan spring that we captured through EMBERS. And you'll see this, this red bubble indicates all the EMBERS alerts that were issued for that period and what the ground truth, the blue circles are. And you'll see this how well the EMBERS as a system has captured the geographical spread of these protests, which started in San Cristobal and which originates from one key event that takes place, and that protest mushrooms into wide variety of reasons and then spread across the country. And this shows you the timeline of how, on ground truth, how the events, the frequency of the events over time, and how the EMBERS adapted itself from the initial burst that it missed, and then when the key trigger event happened, and how from there on, how we pick up all the events and forecast those events along with the ground truth. So EMBERS is a fully automated system. What it does is it has a big server farm where there are specific servers for ingestion, enrichment, and this diagram basically explains the different key components EMBERS as a system has. We are currently ingesting over 5 terabytes of data per day of just for tweets alone. And so everything is running on Amazon Cloud. We can spin off in an automated fashion multiple replicas of EMBERS for targeting different regions, different domains. And all we need is some sort of subject matter expert providing us with some seed keywords, some key things to look out for, and then the models take over. So our approach is basically using a multi-model approach, and as I explained before that, using just crowd behavior or what the crowd opinion is not always right. You need to marry collective intelligence along with it. And in our case, what we do is this collective intelligence is provided by these machine learning models, which use that surrogate data, the indicators of a forecast, and use each model is an expert with some half knowledge about some key aspects of the forecasting landscape. So in this way, all the models sort of capture the holistic landscape of a protest event. So the OSI program started out with some milestones for every 12 months. And this shows you how well we did throughout that period. And one key metric that was used was the lead time. So lead time is basically saying how well in advance we are able to generate a forecast. So this is not simply a detection system that, oh, today I detected an event. No, we have to generate a warning well before, like at least a day before an event is actually going to take place. So that's beating the news. And before it's reported in the news. So that's why we call it beating the news. And that was the title of a research paper that we published with this. And you'll see that by the end, our current average lead time is over 10 days. And so the quality metric is using all the key components of a warning, like I explained before, the population, event type, and date, and the location. So that governs quality. And our recall and precision are pretty good. We kept up with the standards that were provided through the OSI program metrics. And what we've been doing now is spinning EMBERS as a service, a subscription service, where we offer this service to a variety of government organizations as well as nonprofits in human rights cases where they want to know, the analyst wants to know what are the situations that are unfolding in a different region, right? And then we are also adapting EMBERS for a variety of verticals. Cyberbullying is one of the new cases that we are currently working on. And we're always open to more collaborations with this. So with that, This is the end of my talk. If you have any questions.
First of all, give it up for Mr. Rupen. Thank you very much for your talk. So, are there any questions?
Yep.
Yes, please.
Hello, I'm Andrew Krill from Pipedrive, and I was wondering if you have considered the, well, evil ramifications of such software, and how do you make sure that you're not going to be, your software wouldn't be used for such purposes?
I get that question all the time. So, so this is not a very invasive technology. This is, as I said, the key driver of this technology is the open source nature of it. This is based on the information that you and I have already put out in the public, right? So, well, it depends on the user, right? If the good nature of the user is for the protection of the population, then it serves the right purpose. But any simple tool can be made evil in the wrong hands. So it doesn't specifically state that this technology can be used in the wrong hands, and we cannot really do any minority reporting kind of changes, right? So when we generate these alerts, these are basically advisories that something might happen, but you cannot, and we tackle population dynamics, right? So you cannot, just because you released a warning, that doesn't mean that you can change the course of that protest or that event just because you have issued a warning or an alert through the system.
Yes, the young lady in front, yeah, first.
Hi, Nellie Orr, iDefense. You clearly had a whole lot here, and you were trying to summarize it very briefly. Different types of events would have very different indicators, and the example of an upcoming protest where people are calling to protest saying show up on such and such a date, that seems pretty straightforward, I would think. In the case of the airport, you showed a couple of sample tweets, and there was something about someone saying, oh, they kicked someone off a plane because of a toothbrush, and then that was retweeted. And so that brought up the bigger question of retweets and what that means in terms of your measurement, because does that reflect necessarily the perceived threat, the real threat, and how do you address the problem of trolls and bots as well?
So for your first question, we do take into account how much of one particular tweet has been retweeted or replied to. And we have this multi-model approach, and each modeler, when they're building this model, it caters to the algorithm, right? So one algorithm actually does take into account how many times it's retweeted, and that algorithm is, for example, planned protest. What planned protest does, it looks at the calls to events that people have made on Twitter. They're saying that, oh, let's go protest at this point and this location, and how many times that it's retweeted gives the model the confidence of releasing a forecast. And towards your second question, could you repeat that?
Whether retweets represent, like in cases other than the protest, does it, like, say a lot of people happen to retweet about the airport where somebody was kicked off a plane? Does that reflect real threat, or just that a whole lot of people happen to have their phones out that day, or a certain month, a lot of young people happen to be at the airport that day, not at the other airport?
I think, yeah, I mean, we do take into account the retweet activity. I think your second question was the troll activity. Yeah. So that issue we took into account when we were doing election modeling. So for example, in Venezuela, there were a lot of pro-government bots that were running. So we have some machine learning probabilistic models which take into account the bot activity and normalizes that signal along with it. Detecting trolls is much harder, and lately we have also are facing cases of fake news on Twitter and other social media sites. So tackling trolls, it's a little different from suppressing or normalizing the signal for bot activity. You have to actually understand or classify the sentiment and see how polarizing it is. And sentiment analysis is not something that we fully cater to in EMBERS. We sort of we sort of reserved EMBERS for very high quality signals and not get into the whole sentiment analysis. So that's something we did not address up till now.
Does it answer the question? Okay. Professor.
I read an article some time ago, I don't know if it was from yourselves or not, about predicting stock market movements, talking on Twitter. I don't know, was that your work, or was it?
So we have one paper by one of the graduate students early in 2013 or 12 about using open source indicators for stock market prediction. But so using crowdsourcing techniques, the predicting or market predictions has a very, it's been done and done in a quite different ways through other researchers also, not just us. And initially when EMBERS, the OSI program started, the stock market modeling was one of the verticals along with civil unrest and rare disease modeling, but it was removed from the program because it's such a sort of a pseudoscience to forecast stock markets, because there's so many factors that are beyond, like you could use sentiment analysis or the crowd opinion about how the market is moving, but to actually generate a forecast, that was considered a lot more work and did not fall into the OSI program.
So are you saying then that the original paper that I read is now no longer true? That
no, I'm not saying that. So there have been a lot of research done with market predictions using Twitter and other social media websites that now do either sentiment analysis or do opinion modeling, right? And within EMBERS, we did not consider that. That's the only distinction I want to make, but we already have one paper, but at that same time, stock market prediction was done by a lot of other researchers who just started with Twitter.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Ruben, for that nice presentation. We have some candy for you to take home with. I know you're flying to India after this, so you might need to eat it before then.
Thank you.
So we're going to go on with a presentation concerning OpenSky. So we heard just before a prediction which is 24/7, all day long, all year long. And also here we have a system which hopefully runs 24/7 and gives us flight data and tracks the planes correctly.
All right, thanks for the introduction. Hi and welcome on my talk to Crowdsourcing Security for Wireless Air Traffic Communications. This is work by myself, my colleagues and supervisor Matthew Smith and Eva Martinovic at Oxford, Matthias Schäfer from the University of Kaiserslautern, and Vincent Lender from Amerswiss, who's somewhere here with me, I think. Let me state first that we've been here in the exact same position last year with a broader paper on cybersecurity in aviation. And after that talk, Vincent got quite a few good questions on how to address some of these security problems. So we decided to investigate them for this year and come back here and talk about this. And of course, we also simply really liked CyCon last year, so there's that. Quick roadmap to our talk. First, I'll briefly give a brief introduction to air traffic control, so you have a necessary background. We talk about our threat model. Then the main point, improving the security of air traffic control using crowdsourcing, before we conclude with some extensions and final comments. So first of all, this diagram shows us the general way how air traffic control works currently. On the right-hand side, we have primary radar, which is a traditional way of doing independent, non-cooperative radar surveillance. So as it works, you send some high-powered energy into the air, and objects such as aircraft typically reflect the energy back down to the Earth. On the left-hand side, we have the secondary surveillance radar, which works in a different way. Basically, it needs the cooperation of the aircraft. So the ground station interrogates aircraft using digital messages on the 1030 megahertz channel, and then the aircraft, when they are equipped with a transponder, they will answer with their ID, altitude, and other information. At larger airports, these two sources of information are then joined together, and they make up the recognized air picture, which is basically what air traffic controllers have on their radar. Finally, we have the so-called next generation of air traffic control, at the heart of which we have the automatic dependent surveillance broadcast protocol. So if we go through these buzzwords, we know that it's automatic, so contrary to before, it's always on, there's no interrogation necessary. The aircraft send information every few seconds, every second. It is dependent, so the information does not come from ground sources, but it comes from the actual instruments on board of the aircraft. And surveillance basically says, okay, we now get much more information. We get precise position, contrary to before, altitude, speed, heading, velocity, identification, and actually a bunch of other information. Finally, important point, all this is broadcast regularly. So yeah, no interrogation, no addressing to anyone. It is broadcast to any aircraft in the vicinity, ground station, anyone else who is equipped to listen. And an important point I want to note here, aircraft that are already equipped with general SSR transponders, they are or were easy to upgrade to this next generation system. So whether it actually deserves that name is up for debate. But it was fairly cheap to do this, and that's an important point that we come back to. This is one of our more popular slides over the years, unfortunately, because people are still surprised by it. Even in this next generation system that is just being rolled out, there's absolutely no built-in security. There's nothing that provides cryptography, it doesn't provide authentication, nothing that is useful. Whatever you can think of doing, you can do on that wireless channel, which you will come to in a bit. So you might ask yourself, why is this? Why has this come about? And we identified 3 reasons over the years. First of all is the very long development and certification cycles in aviation. It's a very safety-focused industry, as we know, and their track records are quite good. It's constantly improving. And this is one of their methods. However, in case of more modern communication technology, that's a very long time. ADS-B has taken over 2 decades. It was started to being developed in the early 90s, being rolled out roughly about 10 years ago. The original mandate was that every aircraft was supposed to have this technology by 2017. Well, at the moment, roughly 70% of all aircraft are equipped with it. Mandate has been pushed back to 2020. I'm very skeptical that this will go through. Second reason, there are lots of legacy and compatibility requirements. If we do air traffic control, we want to be sure that wherever we fly, people understand what we are saying, our messages. So it should be understood around the world. And on the legacy side, we can make sure that this happens if we just keep all technologies around and keep using them and maybe just slightly upgrading. Which ties into the third point, cost pressures. Airlines, other actors are not particularly happy to spend a lot of money on new technology unless it provides them with direct operational financial benefits. So again, this is why things are rather being upgraded and rather slowly. At this point, let's talk about the threat models in our research. This is the traditional threat model, a nation state, unlimited resources, motivation is some kind of warfare. And to be honest, this is not something we consider, because in a system that has absolutely no built-in security, the most that you can do without introducing proper new technologies, cryptography, is to be able to inconvenience such an actor. There's no way you can actually stop everything that they want to do. So last year we came up with a new model for aviation, and we also now consider different threat actors with slightly more limited resources. They include cybercrime, cyber terrorists, but also simple script kiddies, hobbyists that play around with cheap hardware and software. And all of these are actually fairly common. their capabilities might differ in strength, let's say signal strength of their attacks or radius range, but in general, that's not a fundamental difference and rather an engineering problem. So let's look at the potential attacks here. First, just let's consider the normal case, ADS-B transmission by an aircraft to a ground station. So as you can see here, on the left, we have an identifier, 24-bit. That's broadcasted in a message alongside with a few other messages on position, velocity, and heading, for example, altitude included. So now we introduce an attacker, symbolized here by a software-defined radio. And in the first case, this attacker would simply jam our message. So destroy the message coming from the aircraft to the ground station in the air, either by broadband jamming or with more light touch approaches, such as reactive and selective jamming, where we simply destroy the messages in the air that we want to destroy, which is more subtle. The second one are injection attacks. So in this case, we don't actually have an aircraft in the air, and the attacker injects all the necessary messages into the system to create a fake or ghost aircraft, as it's popularly called, and that would then show up on a radar screen without additional verification layers. So at this point, radar screen would see perfectly normal aircraft on that screen without any indication that it's fake. And the third case, an attacker simply modifies the data on the air. This is definitely the most complex. It would involve some bit flipping of the message in the air, or first jamming the message, destroying it, and then injecting other messages to be able to spoof the aircraft and pretend to be that aircraft. So in that case, we could, for example, simply change the altitude, not the other things shown on the radar screen, which is more complex but also more devious, clearly. This brings us to crowdsourcing in general. The attacks that you've just seen, you can conduct them with software-defined radio hardware available from around $300 now. The software can be downloaded from the internet, slightly modified, and you're set to go. But in general, you can even have a receiver for $10 that you can see here, which is actually more or less a DVB-T stick. And these are really, really popular around the world. So a combination of a lot of people with these $10 sticks and really motivated volunteers. This is one of our colleagues installing a slightly more expensive system on his house. And a combination of these two things basically power all of the commercial air trackers that you might know, flight radar, FlightAware, plane spotters. Luckily for us, you can stream all this information to more than one service, including us. So many of these people stream it to our own network, OpenSky. You can go to the website here and see it live in action. And we use this as basis for our research and also for our crowdsourced security approach. You see the current deployment here. We've been growing a lot, actually. So it's 700 plus sensors by now, 200 to 300 of which are registered sensors, and 500 are basically the anonymous crowd that we're talking about. At the moment, we're covering or we're receiving and storing roughly 10 billion messages per day. So it's actually requiring quite a large big data infrastructure. And we believe this can also be used to improve the security of ATC quickly and efficiently. So advantages, some key advantages of crowdsourced security here. First of all, we do not need to adapt the existing global aircraft and ATC infrastructure. And as you might have gathered from the previous points, this is a big advantage. We can directly improve existing and deployed legacy systems. Furthermore, the attack detection system doesn't have to pass all of these certification processes because it's not directly safety relevant for an aircraft to fly. Another advantage, it provides us lots of agility and flexibility. There's a large open source crowd involved in this aircraft tracking. And people also for OpenSky are working on open source software. They can test their approaches with real data and test and deploy a lot of new approaches very fast. And last but not least, you can achieve very, very quick global coverage with high sensor density. There are tens of thousands of sensors around supplying the large commercial trackers at the moment. So that's a large pool of people that we can tap into. And indeed, we use this high sensor density for several new approaches outside of cryptography, and we call them cyber-physical defense methods, because we exploit the physical characteristics of aircraft signals instead of their content to verify the actual contents of the message sent around. So this table shows 4 different approaches we looked at for this paper. First of all are simple plausibility checks, which you can do with a single receiver, very low complexity. Basically, you check whether whatever you get from the aircraft even makes sense. If it's outside of the receiver's physical range, then clearly something is up. Similarly, the second approach, cross-referencing. If you have a number of overlapping sensors, you can cross-reference their information, and if they should have received the same data but are reporting different data, then we have to decide what's going on here. Based on this, the more complex example is multilateration, which you might know from the older Lorentz systems. So basically, we exploit the time differences of arrival at our receivers. So if you have 4 more receivers, you measure the signal time and look at the differences, and then you can create so-called hyperboloids, seen here, or part of them at least, and you can solve for the origin of the signal based on this data. So if an aircraft is sending, or if somebody pretends to be an aircraft is sending from a different position than an actual aircraft, we can localize that position and know it's not actually where they are. The nice part here is that it does not need synchronization between the receivers and the aircraft, because ADSB and these systems, they don't offer that, they don't have timestamps. And even if they did, an attacker could simply, without security, fake that timestamp as well to pretend to be in a different position. But it also has some downsides. While multilateration is quite popular, it is fairly complex. It is used in aviation, but it costs a lot of money there. And while we can do it with our sensors just fine, as we've seen, you need a lot of them sensors in a given coverage area. So it's not as good to cover large areas as we've seen. So we come with some other systems as well, based on the same time differences of arrival. Instead of localizing, we just want to verify that it's true, what an aircraft is saying. So we, first of all, analyze the expectations. So we look up what should be the timings from that given position that an aircraft claims to be in. And then we compare these expectations with our measurements. You run fairly simple hypothesis tests, and actually within 10, 20, 30 messages, you can find out that someone is not at the position that they claim to be. You can look at the reference here. This gives us quite a good detection metric, very few false positives, with like only 2 receivers and a much better coverage than multilateration here. We've done some theoretical security analysis on all of these approaches. I won't go into the detail of those here, but you can find them in the proceedings paper. So what do we do if we have actually detected someone? What can we do with OpenSky or in air traffic control in general? Well, if we detect something, we can first of all flag the track that we've detected and claim, okay, this one seems to be unreliable, and the controller can, let's say, just use his voice to call an aircraft and see what's going on. Is there actually someone there? Second, if we're really sure that these are fake messages, we can drop them before they're processed, before they're shown on the radar screen, and keep the impact on the controller low. Last of the 3 points here, as I mentioned, if you have enough receivers, you might even be able to localize the position of the origin of the attack, and at that point, well, you might simply drive there and destroy it with a club, and then things are also fine. Finally, we have to consider insider attacks in our system, of course. So Bootstrapping Trust is quite hard, as I believe we'll also hear in the last talk. What we did in the beginning is to start out with our own receivers. So we have a lot of colleagues, friends, our own receivers, and friends of friends, real-world colleagues, people we trust, even people in the community that we've met personally. And we're fairly trusting in their receivers, where they're positioned, and that they don't do anything nefarious. So there's a feasible way to kick things off, but clearly you see this is not scalable. And as I mentioned, we have 500 and more growing anonymous receivers, and we don't have a direct control over these. So what can we do here and defend against someone who tries to inject false data, not onto the wireless channel, but into actually the data stream sent from the sensor to our network? Well, first of all, we of course run some sanity checks. Again, if it doesn't make sense what they send, we will drop it and not display this. Second important point is cross-sensor data validation. So you see in the picture here, if we have a few trusted receivers, and we have an untrusted receiver here, we will again check whatever a single sensor is saying, cross-reference it with other sensors, and, well, label them as unreliable. And over time, we are even able to, if a sensor is deemed reliable by the other sensors around them, sending us correct data for a long time, we can also elevate their trust status to a certain high level. However, if we have a lot of people collaborating in one area, in particular, if they pretend to be, or if they send proper data for a long time, and then suddenly start collaborating, attacking the system, and jointly send wrong data from all of the messages from an aircraft in a given area, then there's very little that we can do at this point. Because if they have a majority in a given area, any kind of voting systems, cross-referencing here will not help. Even with OpenSky as a central authority, there's relatively little you can do here. So let me talk about some possible future extensions. First one is quite obvious, what I've just said. It would be a good idea to add some certificates to improve the trust. It is a non-trivial approach because all of the existing streaming protocols used for air traffic control data, they don't have anything authentication, encryption built in. So that would need some new developments, which is entirely possible, but will take some time and convincing to do. So this is being uptaken. Another problem, however, is that it's a certain community, and many of the people like being anonymous, and they don't want to be verified, certified, like they don't necessarily, they want to keep being anonymous. So it would clearly hamper our growth and somehow slightly go against the wisdom of a crowdsourcing security system. So in a way, you might have to keep this optional and try verifying and certifying more sensors, but you definitely want to keep tapping into this whole pool of anonymous receivers as well. The second one, interesting, something we've worked on is the integration of non-stationary or mobile receivers. As you can see here from one of our papers, we've just been looking into receivers in drones, on cars, because they have fairly nice properties. It is even harder to fool a receiver that is mobile and moving at a given speed it's much harder to fool them and the physical properties that we look at because simply don't know where it is at a given time, and it might even be physically impossible to do. So, bringing me to the last slide of my talk here, is there any application for other critical infrastructures? As you may imagine, there are other wireless systems that suffer from very similar problems as aviation. For example, the Automatic Identification System, AIS, used in marine traffic. This is shown here, very similar websites as Flight Radar and the other commercial trackers. Marine traffic, same systems, you get positions from the ships and vessels. Again, no encryption involved, nothing. Has slightly different properties maybe than the aviation scenario because it's all on the surface, so signals don't travel as far. Receivers have to be near the coast. So still, that's, I think, mostly an engineering problem, and there might be well applicable scenarios for crowdsourcing security here in the future. Brings me to the conclusion of my talk. So we've seen legacy technologies and new threat models make wireless attacks likely. I think it's only a matter of time until people try this more. Crowdsourcing can help detect such attacks using cyber-physical means, contrary to non-existing cryptography. So we've seen bootstrapping trust is quite hard. It takes time and maybe some new innovations here. However, we believe this is a feasible and quickly deployable approach to improve security here against many of the threat actors that we consider. With that, I conclude my talk.
Well, thank you. So, are there any questions? Yes, back there. Do we have a microphone? Oh.
Okay, thank you. Hello, Mr. Stohmeier. My name is Ibn Martin from Austria.
Hi.
I'm head of the cybersecurity operations, and I had a case, I think it was 3 years ago, when planes disappeared in the sky while they had been on the route between Italy, Austria, Germany, Swiss. Do you have any explanation for that thing? Because they disappeared also on your systems, as far as I know.
Yes.
As far as I know, I'm not sure.
No, it does.
Thank you.
Yes, I've read the EADS report on this. So what happened there, according to their investigations, was someone placed in the Czech Republic. There were some receivers that were over-interrogating, like Mode S receivers that were over-interrogating the aircraft. And many of the aircraft involved had the flaw on their transponder that when they were being over-interrogated, they would overheat and shut off. This is what happened. So they shut off, and they were gone twice in 3 days, I believe, from the radar screens. And yes, they had to go procedural. They didn't deem it an attack. They think somebody was testing a multilateration system. They tried to pinpoint it, but couldn't completely find it, just the general area. They didn't think it was an attack, but this is exactly what anyone could do, which is essentially my point. Even if it wasn't an attack, someone else could do this. They fixed the overheating problem with these transponders, but I wouldn't bet on the fact that there are no other problems in this.
Are there any other questions? Yes. First, the gentleman back there.
My name is Gabriel Jakschis. I'm from the US, and my question is the following. It's known that statistical crowdsourcing, especially if you're doing multi-fusion from multiple sources, is heavily dependent on the initial settings and thresholds. And have you looked into the case that you are taking account not so much statistical data, but in addition, kind of domain-specific information? For example, if you know something about the mission of the entities or about the type of the planes or anything which is beyond statistical information.
We haven't looked into it specifically for statistical approaches. I think this is quite sensible. I think many of the big flight trackers fuse all of the data, including let's say for the mission, they know where it's coming from, what airport it is going to, which you know for all commercial aircraft. However, not everyone has to file a flight plan, like smaller private aircraft don't have to. So you might not get that kind of data. But in a system, in a larger system, it would be absolutely sensible to integrate all of the information, but we haven't done this so far.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I saw there were 2 more questions, but I would ask you to ask Dr. Stohmeier after the session, or Dr. Vincent Blenders, who's sitting back there. He will be also willing to help you, because otherwise we run out of time for our last speaker. So thank you. He's also some candy for you.
Thank you.
Don't eat it right now. You might get a shock. Yeah, so before we track your flight, Professor Chadwick, and you fly home, and I asked Rupen to clarify what the risk of Tallinn Airport is. I would like to introduce you, or like to give you the stage to talk about your trust broker, which might solve the problem, or
well, it
might
might contribute something. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the trust broker from the latest version of the X509 standard, and we'll look at why has it evolved, why is it needed, and a little bit about the proof of concept implementation that my colleagues have done at the University of Toulouse in France. And I can assure you that my collaboration with France will continue, Brexit regardless. So looking then at X509, you may be surprised, if you're as old as I, you won't be surprised, to find out that it came out in 1988, the first version. That was prior to the internet as we know it, and it was prior to the development of the World Wide Web. Tim Berners-Lee hadn't invented the World Wide Web by 1988. And nobody was using PKI. It was still very much a research tool at that time. But the trust model was specified back in 1988, and the trust model has not evolved from then until 2016, to the latest version of the standard. So that might surprise some of you that we're looking at a really old trust model that predated the internet as we know it. And since then, the versions have not touched that, as it shows you there. And so really, we had something that really wasn't fit for purpose in today's world. The original model, and I said this was prior to the World Wide Web, this was prior to anybody using PKI, the original model assumed that when you moved towards the PKI world, everybody would have a certificate from a CA. So we would all be using asymmetric encryption, we'd all have our own key pairs, and we'd all have a CA that we trusted. And so the CA that we got our certificate from was our root of trust. And we had a relationship with it. And so relying parties and certificate subjects were basically one and the same people. And so it gave rise to what's called a three-cornered trust model. And we look at that three-cornered trust model next. And you can see in this trust model originally, if there's just one CA, everybody is certified by the same CA. You get a message and a certificate from someone that you've never met before, but their certificate is signed by your CA, so you can say, okay, I know and I trust my CA. It's signed the certificate of this person I've never met before, might be in a different country, but I know that I can trust that that person is who they say they are. And therefore, I can authenticate that person that I've never met, or that entity I've never met on the internet. And then you say, well, but we don't all have the same certification authority. There may be multiple certification authorities in the world. Okay, so we'll have cross-certification for that then. So with cross-certification, the CA that I trust and that's my trust anchor cross-certifies another CA, and that might issue the certificate to the person I'm talking to, or that CA might cross-certify another CA, and eventually there will be this set of cross-certified CAs so that this other person that I'm talking to will have a certificate from some other CA, but nevertheless, I still have a path of trust from that certificate subject through its CA and through the cross-certifications to my CA, so I'm still happy, I can still trust this person from the other side of the world, and I can authenticate them. But that didn't happen. Okay, it never happened. Cross-certification never happened. Why? Primarily because the trust and legal responsibilities that came from that was that if a CA, which was a commercial entity, trusted and cross-certified another CA, and that second CA made a mistake, then you would inherit its liabilities and you'd have to pay for it. So you'd have to pay your customers for the liabilities that arose from another entity that you'd cross-certified and trusted. So essentially, lawyers ensured that cross-certification never happened and doesn't happen today. So what does happen today? Essentially, we've got lots of CAs, each being their own roots of trust, each issuing their own self-issued certificates, and each having their own set of subjects. So that places a great burden now on the relying party, which is the person receiving the certificate. It has to say, okay, I don't know the CA that it's come from, so I have to somehow get the information of that CA and I have to trust it. Do you know how many of these CAs there are? Can you guess? Is it 1? Is it 10? Is it 100? Is it 1,000? Well, it's certainly more than 600 that are in the browsers. Yeah. So it may be in the thousands. It's an impossible task, as you will see. There's no way that you, as this relying party, when you get a certificate signed by a CA, to know and trust these thousands. It's clearly an impossible task. So the state of the art. PKI is working. It's ubiquitous. Every web server that you talk to has a certificate signed by some CA in the world. And you are wanting to know that that web server is authentic and you're talking to the correct CA. But you don't have relationships with any of them. And I've said there's over 600 of them from many different countries. So how do you know they're trustworthy? Well, what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to download their certificate practice statement. This is a document that says how they operate. This is a document that they publish that says this is what we do to issue certificates. And if you read that, you can say, that's good enough for me. I can trust the certificates that are issued by it. So how many people in this room have even read a single certificate practice statement? Okay, we've got 3 or 4. How many have read all 600? Okay, nobody. So you see the scale of the problem that we're facing. But we have helpers on our side. We have browser manufacturers and operating system providers. And they are the ones that put these CAs into your operating system and into your browser. They are the ones that are supposed to have read these 600 or more, and they're the ones supposed to say, yes, they're trustworthy. But they don't always get it right. And if they get it wrong, what damages do they give you? Well, unfortunately, they don't give you any. When you download the operating system or the browser software, you'll have signed or agreed to a license which says they don't take any responsibility for this at all. So you're trusting them to validate certificates and CAs, but they won't take any responsibility for anything that goes wrong. And many are not trustworthy. There's just a few examples here. I think I'll pick out the middle one because that's the most noteworthy. Did you know, Tar, were the CA for the Dutch government? And they were hacked, and they issued fraudulent certificates, and it made them go bankrupt. So there was a period of time when the Dutch government didn't have a certification authority. I hope there's no one from the Dutch government here. You are? Yes. So you know that? Yeah, you know it from bitter experience. The problems that can arise if certificate authorities get it wrong. There's also the compelled certificate creation attack and similar attacks like this where man in the middle will issue certificates or have certificates issued for them, and then when you connect to a website, you're actually not connecting to the website, but you're connecting to some man in the middle, and the browser sees this certificate and says it's genuine when it's not, and then all your messages are intercepted and everything that you're sending, confidential information, is available to the man in the middle. And there's even a company in Arizona that advertises this product and actually says, yes, we support man in the middle, and this is ideal for working in an internet cafe where you can actually intercept all the messages. But then it's not just governments do it. I was at St Pancras Station in London this last week, and they've got a man in the middle there, and they're intercepting all the traffic. They don't tell you that, but they are, and I knew they were because I could detect it when I was actually on the internet. So this happens in a lot of places where you have men in the middle with certificates that are intercepting your traffic. So how do we manage? Well, we manage because we trust the browser and OS manufacturers to do the job for us and to validate that the CAs are trustworthy. And they should only add trustworthy root certificates to the browsers. And if they find they're not trustworthy, they should remove them. But they don't. You can still find certificates in your browsers with MD5 hashing algorithm in them. And as those of you know, MD5 is weak, and it was used by the advanced persistent threats in Stuxnet, etc. So we've got known vulnerabilities, and the browser manufacturers are still putting them there and still saying these are trustworthy, when we know they're not. They should offer liabilities if they get it wrong, but they don't. They should check revocation information for certificates that have been revoked. But actually, Google actually make a thing about we don't check revocation information. They state publicly now that in Chrome, they do not do revocation checking, which is quite an amazing thing to admit to. They should check all the policy information in certificates, that the certificates have been used for what the key usage says it should be used for, etc. They don't do it. So we had a paper that was published about 8 years ago, which looked at this and found they didn't go according to plan. We've got one coming out this year in Compact 2017, which has done another analysis and found that they're still not getting it right. There's been an improvement in the last 8 years. There's been an improvement, but it's still not there. So the answer is no, we can't manage. So the current trust model, in reality, is not the three-cornered trust model that X509 said it should be. It's actually a four-cornered trust model, but we as web users, unconsciously, because it's not a conscious decision that we make, we just download the software and we use it. Unconsciously, we have to trust hundreds, potentially, of these trust anchors, made up of all the browser suppliers we have to trust, all the operating system suppliers, all the apps developers, all the apps you download onto your mobile phone which are using PKI, they decide who you trust. You perhaps didn't realize that, but they do. So all the app developers you have to trust, and you have to trust all the governments and all the railway stations and all the other public places you go to, that they're not acting as men in the middle as well. So you can see there's an awful lot of people that we're unconsciously trusting in the X509 model, which brings us to the alternative. We introduce a trusted third party, which is called a trust broker, which replaces all those hundreds of entities that we're unconsciously trusting today. And we rely on this entity to work on behalf of us. We have a contractual relationship with this entity. So the same way that a certificate subject has a contractual relationship with the CA that issues a certificate, we have a contractual relationship with Trust Broker, which means we pay an annual fee, and we will be given compensation if anything goes wrong. So we've now got a much more balanced model. The Trust Broker on our behalf will read all these 600 and odd certificate practice statements, and they will determine on our behalf how trustworthy all these certificate authorities are out there, and they will tell us when we ask them. And not only that, they will use crowdsourcing, which I'll show you in our implementation. That's not specified in the standard, but it's something we've built into our implementation, to help them determine how trustworthy these CAs are. And then we have a four-cornered trust model. And the rationale model, we presented it in a paper back in 2013, if you want to understand why the model was created. So let's look at the model then. So now we have a trust broker, and we have a contractual relationship with a trust broker. And when we get a public key certificate, we ask the trust broker about the trustworthiness of this certificate. Can we trust this certificate that's been issued by this certification authority? Should we say that that subject is valid or is not valid? And should we go ahead with our transaction on the internet or not? Now, the X500 model doesn't solve everything. It's given you the model, but it doesn't give you any protocols. This has never been the purpose of X509. It's never standardized protocols. It's left it up to other parties like the IETF. So there aren't standardized protocols in there. Obviously, it doesn't build software either. The standard doesn't build software, so there's no software provided by the standard. It doesn't provide business models. It didn't provide a business model for certification authorities. It doesn't provide a business model for trust brokers. So that will still need to be worked out by the entities that offer it. But as I say, these have traditionally been outside the scope of X509. So my colleagues at the University of Toulouse built the first prototype of this. And the mode of operation is as follows. You make a TLS connection to a website, and then a plugin in your browser talks to the trust broker and says, what's the trustworthiness of certificates issued by this CA? Now, you've got privacy protection because you don't have to tell the trust broker who you're talking to. You just have to say, it's this certification authority who issues lots of certificates. What do you know about the trustworthiness of the certificates that are issued by this CA? And now it's already read all those CPs and CPSs, so it knows and it can actually respond to you about that. But it's also done crowdsourcing and got information from the customer base about the CA as well, because there's what I say I do, and there's what I really do. Now, the CPS just says what I say I'm going to do. So if you evaluate the CPS of a CA, you only know what it says it's going to do. You don't know what it actually does in reality. So this is why you need to source other information, say, well, what is it really doing in reality? Can we really trust that the CA is trustworthy and does what it says it's going to do in its CPS? So that's why we have this extra mechanism built in there. And then there's the confidence also that the trust broker's got in its own calculations. And then it sends an answer back to the browser, and the browser displays that to the user, and then the user can decide whether he wants to go ahead with a transaction or not. So the plugin in the browser sends a message to the trust broker, says, what's the quality of the certificate that's been issued by this CA? And it returns the quality of the certificate, quality of assurance, and other information back to the browser. Now, how does it do it? It evaluates the CP and the CPS, plus any audit report that's available from the auditing of the CA, plus crowdsourced reports from users, from subjects, and from other relying parties, and from other trust brokers, because we expect that the trust brokers would probably form a network to help each other out as well. And from that, it feeds it into a semi-automatic calculation thing. So we've got an XML document which will semi-automatically compute an initial trust component based on the CPS. So you fill in the values from the actual CPS. You say what its key usage fields are and what its frequency of revocation information is and what its key lengths, etc. And from that, you can compute the quality of the CPS. That's the quality of the CA in saying what it says it does. So you get one number now out to say this is the trustworthiness based on what it says it does. And then you use the trust and reputation model from the crowdsourced information to say, and this is what it's actually doing in practice. And you combine them together, which is the quality of the CA in practice and the confidence level that the trust broker has in it. And then you produce this quality assurance metric that you pass back to the relying party. I say all of that is semi-automatic in the software. This is a diagrammatic representation of what happens, that you get the information from the CA, from its CPS, you feed that into the model. Now, inside this model, there's a lot of knowledge. There's a lot of IPR built in by the trust broker, because the trust broker has to weigh up the various factors. It has to say how important, for example, is the way I authenticate a subject according to the key length. What's the weights of the various factors? How important is the frequency of revocation against these various factors? So there's a lot of intellectual property that goes in there, which the trust broker want to keep confidential inside his own knowledge. So it will be the fact that if you have two separate trust brokers, based on the same CPS, they will come up with different scores because they will have different knowledge bases and different skills that they put in there. And it's rather like the referencing agencies that do credit scoring and credit referencing. You'll get different scores from the different credit referencing agencies because they have different models or they have different computations and they're using different expertise, but you get some sort of general idea. So that's So this would all be the intellectual property of the trust broker who's building it. So here's the prototype architecture. You've got the trust broker service. You can see that it's feeding into its recommendation. It's getting information from other trust broker services. It's getting information from its own relying parties. So the relying party can be asked, this is what the CA says it does in certificates it issues. Does the certificate that you've got conform to what the CA says it does? And if it does, you as a relying party can feed information back into the trust broker, say, yeah, the certificate I've got conforms to what you said it should be. And so that'll give it a tick and say, well, the CA is doing well there because that certificate conforms to what the CA said it would do. And you can get messages from other certificate holders as well. And of course, these messages will be weighted, that messages from trust brokers and audit agencies may be regarded more highly than messages from relying parties, which will be regarded more highly than messages from just any old certificate holder. And again, that will be part of the intellectual capital of the trust broker to build at. So here's a picture of the proof of concept implementation. You go to Facebook and you want to log in. So you put in your username and password and you select send. Now, you don't know necessarily which website you're going to. That website is not necessarily the same website that gave the same page. You could be sending it off to a different website with a different certificate. So it will actually retrieve the certificate from the site you're going to, and then it will send the information to the trust broker to say, what do you think about this CA that's issued this certificate? And you get a message back which says what the level of trustworthiness is, and it gives you other information about what the name of the CA is, and if it's said it will give any compensation, if that's in its certificate practice statement or whatever the trust broker says. And that's it, basically. So that summarizes my talk. Are there any questions that anyone would like to ask?
Yes, here in front, yes. Is that about Netherlands again?
Yeah, oh, okay.
Sorry, I'm Giardinia from Netherlands. I've got a question. How trustworthy of how reliable is a trust broker?
Well,
one. And the other question is, the trust broker itself has rather a big information position. Isn't that a risk as well?
Well, first of all, the trust broker will be in your country. Every trust broker would be operating in your country because you would have a contract with it. It'd be like an insurance policy. So if you regard it as like an insurance company, you will pay a premium annually for an annual service, and it will be based in your country according to your laws. So if anything does go wrong, you've got the legal mechanism of your country to sue it or whatever. So it's going to be trustworthy in that respect because it's operating inside your country according to your country's terms and conditions, etc. So does that answer your first question? So it may be a global corporation like Dun & Bradstreet, for example, that offer a trust broker service, but they'd have a local office in each country that would actually offer the contract. Just like insurance, you know, you have multinational insurance companies, but they have local offices in each country that actually issue the policies. That was the first. And the second?
The second was, the trust broker has rather a big information position.
Yep.
Isn't that a risk as well?
In what ways? Well, I don't know. It's a risk because, first of all, it's basing its computation initially on the CPS. So that's one piece of information, structured information that's publicly available. So I don't think there's any risk in doing the computation on that. The risk is in its intellectual property. The risk, you say, is in how good is that trust broker in actually making the computations to come out with the trust score, yeah? And also then there's the crowdsourcing of other information. But if you get an insurance policy from a company that never pays out when you've got a claim, then that's also risky. And how do you cover that? Well, you'd have to go to law and ultimately they would go out of business. Yeah?
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor. We have also some candy for you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
I hope you enjoyed on your flight back today.
Thank you.